The issues facing the American voter in the 2008 election are really, really complicated. This is a presentation of what you need to know about the American economy. And what we're going to talk about is how capitalism makes wealth, as we are a capitalistic system, how government spends our wealth, which somewhat undermines the benefits of capitalism, and then the way out. And so let's talk about how capitalism creates wealth. First, we can talk about capitalism's basics, and it has three attributes. One is public ownership of enterprises rather than government ownership of enterprises, as might be true under communism. Free markets, which means free of unnecessary federal regulation. And finally, a profit motivation for business owners, which provides a psychological energy to take risk. And unfortunately, there's a constant tension between all these three elements, which are underlined by greed and stupidity. But for all it's worth, let's take a look at the benefit of capitalism. This is an image that shows the economic output of the world on a per-person basis over the last 2,000 years. I put an arrow here around the year 1800 because that's when the Industrial Revolution kicked in, which was supported by the capitalistic economic model. And you can see on a per-person basis, the economic output of the world just skyrocketed. So for all its weaknesses, there are tremendous benefits from capitalism. Let's take a look at how it works. So first, companies get revenue from the sale of goods and services, and from this they deduct their costs. And important to point out, it's all their costs, including the cost of executives that are frequently paid way too much. But that leaves what's called pre-tax profits. And it's at this point that government takes out taxes. Governments can be federal, state, or local. And what's left is called net profit. And here's what's really important, because under the direction of a board of directors who are elected by the owners of the company, net profits go in one of two directions. One, they're reinvested in the corporation, which causes the corporation to grow, or paid out as dividends to the stockholders. Let's take a look at what that means. When they're reinvested in the corporation grows. That creates more jobs. It also creates higher wages as a company expands and creates new positions. And finally, purchases to inure to the benefit of other corporations. So the whole thing becomes a rather self-fulfilling prophecy, which creates more jobs, more income, and a stronger economy. Alternatively, some of the money can be paid out as dividends to shareholders. This provides cash to whom? Well, usually it's employees, particularly for smaller companies. Investors, they could be small investors like you and me, or investment groups. But more importantly, retirement funds, like 401ks. And these provide the cash for our senior citizens to continue to live well. And in this case as well, more jobs are created in a stronger economy. And that's the capitalism economic model. It's just sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, we took a look at government taking taxes out. Now, let's take a look at what this means. Here we see an image of federal government spending for the last 50 years or so. And you can see in the green line that federal spending on every administration has grown, including the Clinton administration, which had a budget surplus. Why? Because receipts from the internet boom came in at a higher than forecasted rate, which you see here. But under the bus, of course, the converse felt true. But in all cases over time, we've been accumulating a deficit, shown in the red, which really portrays year-over-year deficit. Now, the consequences of this is that we have to gauge in borrowing because we don't have enough money, enough income to pay for our expenditures. And what's that mean? Well, let's take a look at where we are in the year 2008. And I'm going to draw a line here at about what federal spending has been over the last 20 years, roughly, as a percentage of our total economic output. It's been a little under 20%. And indeed, that's a safe mark. When it goes over 20%, things get to be a little bit dangerous. The government has attributes of being insolvent. Now, what I want to do is show you 50 years ago how the government spent your tax money. Well, you can see here in the magenta, it was substantially on national defense and secondly on infrastructure, things like highways and schools. But now it's substantially on mandatory entitlement programs, healthcare programs, Medi-Cal, Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And we're spending more money than we take in for these programs, so we're having to borrow and borrow and borrow. And what's that mean? We're having, if you look in the future on 2050, net interest. This is not repayment of the principal, just the net interest in growing at an astronomical rate. And that means we simply won't have the income on a national basis to pay our debts. So we're going to have to borrow it from foreign countries. Now, let's take a look at the global economic picture. Right now, we have about 5% of the world's population, leaving the other 95% available. Now, in order to cover our federal expenditures, we simply have to recognize that we're part of a global economy. Now, what's this picture show? It shows the percentage of the world economic output for the last 500 years by major regions. And indeed, shown in red, is the fact that China, for this period in time, in fact, 8 out of the last 10 centuries, China has been the dominant player on the global economic market. Now, shown in blue is what's happened in Western Europe, which was the seedbed for the Industrial Revolution. Somewhere around 1800, as we saw earlier, Western Europe began to dominate the world's economies. Now, in almost our parents' lifetimes and grandparents, the United States, after World War I and World War II, in gray, began to show its economic might, and it became the dominant economic player. But what's really transpired is after the fall of the Soviet Union, every economy in the world is now following the capitalistic model. And China in particular is getting stronger and stronger and stronger, as you see here in the last bar, in 12%. And all these countries are transitioning their economies to play on the world scene. Problem is, here in America, we don't seem to be too aware of that. So what's really transpired is in the last year or so, while we've been crying in our beer about the middle class, whatever that is, our global economic centers, because of overregulation of our corporations, Wall Street has moved to London. Similarly, America was once the hotbed, the center of scientific research, and because we couldn't afford to put in a new large-scale collider in Texas, the Europeans have took over and opened up the Large Hadron Collider on the Swiss-French border, and not only has Wall Street moved to Europe, so has the Center for High Energy Research. And similarly, China, as you know, just sent up some astronauts having their first spacewalk. So we're losing our lead in space as well. And these are very, very important issues, and they must be tended to when we look at our economic policies.